Hey guys, welcome to Telling the Told and Untold. My name is Tshego. Before we go straight into today's case, I do have a few content warnings for you guys. This video does involve physical, sexual, and domestic abuse. We talk about substance and drug abuse, suicide, and this case does involve children. It is a heavy one, and it's a case I've been wanting to cover for a while, but every time I go through it, it's very difficult to get through, so that is my warning to you guys. If that's not something you think you're interested in watching, then this video probably isn't for you. So maybe you can watch some of my other videos or just wait for my next upload. The names of the perpetrators and some of the victims have not been released, and this is to protect the victims who are still minors. Therefore, I will be using fake names just to make this story easier to follow. On the 19th of May 2014, the Fenter family were getting ready for bed. 18-year-old Chandra was downstairs. She was on her phone scrolling through Facebook when the family's two small dogs started barking uncontrollably. She then heard a small knock on the door, and as she was about to go answer it, her dad came downstairs and kind of pushed her away, and then he looked through the curtain and he saw this small boy standing outside. He was only wearing a pair of shorts and his body was completely scarred. Mr. Fenter then opened the door to let this little boy in, and all he said was that they shouldn't tell his father where he is because his father would kill him. The little boy then sat on the couch, and Chandra went to go get two sweaters and a blanket for him, and as she gave them to him and watched him put them on, he was so tiny and fragile that the sweater just kept falling off of his shoulders. She then sat next to him and he was shaking, and she soon realized that he wasn't shaking because he was cold. He was shaking in fear. All he kept saying was that his father was going to kill him. Mrs. Fenter had joined her husband, and they were just talking in hushed voices, trying to figure out what they were going to do with this young boy. They knew their neighbor. They had only met him once when he was moving in, and he just seemed like a normal, alright guy. They really didn't think much of him, and they had also met his wife, and they knew that she was pregnant when they had moved in, but they didn't know that they had any other children. Whilst they were still trying to figure out what they were going to do, they were scared to call the police because they thought maybe the police would just send the boy home. So they decided to try and call Childline, and they called them several times, and each time Childline did not answer. Not knowing what to do, they just kept trying to figure out what would be the best option for this boy when they heard a knock on the door. They went to go open the door, and they saw a teenage girl as well as this blonde woman next to her, and the teenage girl just asked if they could please send out her young brother because he had to get home before their dad got home because he would be in big trouble. The blonde woman and the teenage girl then walked inside the Fenter home to the living room where they found this young boy, and the blonde woman just started telling him that he shouldn't be scared, that nothing was going to happen to him, that they just needed to go home and everything was okay. As the Fenters were still trying to understand what was going on, the young boy's father stormed into the house. He didn't even greet the Fenters or acknowledge them. He went straight towards his son and then slapped him several times and pulled him out of the house, not before muttering under his breath that he was going to kill him. The teenage girl then followed, and the blonde woman too, but not before stopping to the Fenters and saying sorry for causing them any trouble, and just said that her son was naughty, and then they left. The Fenters were left flabbergasted. They just didn't know what had happened, and they went to bed. The next day, Mrs. Venter just couldn't stop thinking about what had happened the night before in her living room, so she decided to call the Springs police station and tell them about what had happened. A few hours later, 17 police officers and 3 social workers showed up at a double-story home in Springs. And once they got there, there was a man outside with like a walkie-talkie, and he radioed inside the house to tell someone that they had visitors and the police had a search warrant. They then waited outside until eventually a blonde woman came outside and she said that they were allowed inside of the house. 4 children were removed from the house that day. 3 toddlers under 5, a 16-year-old teenage girl, and the 11-year-old boy that Mrs. Venter had called about was missing, and the police feared the worst. The story of the blonde woman begins in 1996 when 2 teenagers meet for the first time. The blonde woman, the one who had opened the door for the police, met her husband when she was just 16 years old, and we will call her Sam. Sam lost her father when she was just 11 years old, and then afterwards her mom remarried and basically just abandoned her children. Sam then went to live with her older sister and she continued to attend school until she met a 17-year-old boy who we will call John. And Sam meeting John would change her entire life. She then left school and the 2 of them were soon engaged, and they lived with John's parents in the East Rand. From very early on, Sam and John's relationship was said to be violent, and Sam's sister remembers there was one time where Sam had done something to upset John, so he took her and put her over his lap and then spanked her like she was a child. John had told Sam that his father had physically abused him when he was very young, and he had also been assaulted by one of his father's friends. John's parents were also in a very violent relationship, and there was one time when John and Sam had left the house, because remember they stayed with John's parents and they were away for the weekend, when John received a phone call that there had been a shooting in his home. Immediately he and Sam went to his house, and there he found his mother dead in a pool of blood, and his father was barely hanging on to life. It's alleged that John's mother shot his father before turning the gun on herself. His father did survive, and then the young couple left John's parents' home and they decided to live with other relatives. Soon John and Sam got married, and in June 1998, Sam gave birth to her first child, who they named Yolandi, and Yolandi is her real name. The family then moved across the country while John tried to find work. They lived in Richards Bay, Zanin, Orange Free State, and they always lived in caravans or in someone's house. And it's also said that occasionally they would return to the East Rand, to John's parents' home, and stay there for a bit. When Yolandi was 5 years old, her brother was born and they named him Herman, and this is also his real name. Yolandi describes her father as always having been an angry man and her mother as being meek and distant. However, when Herman was born, that dynamic shifted and John became even more angry than he was, and he was constantly bursting out with anger. John would also discipline Yolandi physically when she was a child, and the violence between him and Sam was also constant. When Herman was just 3, he couldn't be within arm's reach of his father without his father just slapping him for no reason. There was one day when they were in John's buggy and he was upset because he didn't have a fork for the chips that he had just bought, so he decided to take it out on his children. He parked his buggy on the side of the road. He got out, opened the back seat and hit Yolandi and Herman, and after that he threw Herman out of the car and he drove off. Herman then had to run to catch up with the buggy, and somehow he managed to jump in the back. Yolandi also noticed that her mom was completely different with Herman than she was with her. She would hug him and kiss him and also try to play with him, but Sam would never shield Herman away from his father's abuse. And Yolandi really thought that her mom loved Herman more than she loved her. But eventually Sam just stopped caring about Herman as she did with Yolandi and just never showed any love or affection. Yolandi's birth had been registered and she attended school until grade 3, and unfortunately she failed grade 3, and then afterwards her parents just never took her back to school. And when she'd asked her dad why she isn't going to school, her dad told her that she would be safer at home away from the monsters. But little did Yolandi know that the monster was right in her own home. Herman was born in a hospital, but his birth was never registered and he was never enrolled in school. In 2009, Sam gave birth to a daughter and another girl followed less than a year later. Yolandi was 12 years old when they moved into a double-story home in Springs, and the rent was 16,000 Rand a month. And by this time, John was working as a second-hand car salesman and he also sold scrap metal from their home. But soon John started to supplement their income by renting out the 2 rooms outside of the main house just so that he could earn even more money. John also started to sell drugs and he and Sam regularly used cat as well as crystal meth. More than that, John would also not only sell the crystal meth, but he also made it. John had also always looked after his appearance, but soon he started to inject himself with steroids and he would exercise in a gym that he had built for himself on the upper level of the house. And certain steroids are known for increasing someone's aggressiveness, so John injecting himself with steroids just made him an even more angry and violent man. By this time, Herman and Yolandi had learned to walk on eggshells around their father and they would constantly be at his beck and call. But if they didn't do anything to his satisfaction, he would either hit them or he would find the closest object to him and throw it at his children. John had also started insisting that Sam go everywhere with him. So when he would go to work, Sam would also go to work with him. And this left Yolandi at home with her 4 younger siblings. And she was in charge of looking after them. She had to clean the house. She had to make sure there was food constantly on the table. And each time her mom would give birth to a child, she would slowly just start handing over the responsibility to Yolandi. And she remembers that when her little brother was born, Sam had only looked after him for about a week before she just stopped and automatically assumed that Yolandi would be in charge of raising her little brother. And because of this, her siblings didn't really have any sort of relationship with their mother. They saw Yolandi as their mother and even referred to Sam as Tani Sam, like Aunt Sam. None of Sam's children's births were ever registered, nor did any of them receive any schooling. Yolandi was the only one to have received schooling until she was in grade 3. So in order to stop outsiders from asking questions about why the children weren't attending school, they were told to stay inside of the house during the day. Yolandi and Herman also tried their best to keep their siblings away from their father, but sometimes they just really couldn't help it. They were children, they were toddlers, and obviously they just want to run around or try and play with their dad. The youngest was only 2 years old when John picked him up by his feet and swung him against the snooker table as though he was a baseball bat. The 2 young girls would be dragged by their feet up the stairs, by their feet or their hair, and John would also just kick them in their faces. Soon he installed 37 cameras in the house, and the children were watched 24 hours a day. When John would come back from work, Yolandi had to take off his shoes as he would sit down and go through the footage from the day just to make sure that they did what they were supposed to do. If he felt like the older children had been sitting down for too long and not tending to their chores, he would beat them. If he felt as though they disappeared from the view of the cameras for too long, he assumed they had left the house and he would beat them. On weekends, John would go through the footage again just to make sure that he didn't miss any punishable offense. And the children were not allowed to go anywhere without their father. And on the rare occasion that they would have visitors at home, John would do a complete 180. He would play with the children, and as soon as the visitors would leave, he would go back to himself. As I mentioned, John rented out rooms. So one person who was renting out the rooms was Sam's friend, who was a sex worker. And she didn't actually live in the house or in the room that she was renting out, but she would use it for her work. And it was Yolandi's job to prepare the room for the woman and clean up when she was finished. Sam's other friend was a stripper, and when this woman would come to the house, the children were told to stay in their rooms. There was one evening when Yolandi was so hungry because her parents had told the children to go to their rooms before they were able to have dinner that night. So she snuck out of her room and she crept downstairs to the kitchen just in hopes that she would be able to get a piece of bread. And when she kind of looked to see where her parents are, she saw Sam's stripper friend, who was completely nude. Sam herself was also nude, and John was just sitting there watching the 2 women as they just danced and paraded themselves in front of him. It's also said that John was obsessed with sex and he couldn't stand someone denying him what he thought was his right as a man. And Sam also admitted that throughout their marriage, John would also rape her. The couple would also invite their friends to the house so that they could drink and do drugs, and these parties almost always ended in orgies. When Yolandi was 14, she was no longer forced to stay upstairs with the adults when they were partying, and she became their waitress. She would carry around drinks and she would also have to clean up after them. And it was really exhausting for her because during the day she would have to wake up, she would clean, she would look after the children, and at night when the children were asleep, she then had to cater to these adults. There was one night when she was so exhausted that she fell asleep on the stairs, and John saw her. John went to go wake her up, and she was so terrified, and she just expected him to beat her like he always did. But he did something so surprising. He left and then he came back with a plate filled with the drug cat, and he forced her to snort it up to keep her awake so that she could continue to serve the people that came to these parties. And from that night on, Yolandi was given drugs at least 3 times a week, and she was also forced to drink alcohol with the adults. One night, Sam's cousin was over at the house. He was a young man, he was in his 20s, and he went to the house to go visit John. And this is when one of the kids did something to upset him. So John asked him what form of punishment he thought would be best for the children. And this is when Sam's cousin went to the computer and he started searching different torture methods. And this is when he came across waterboarding. And that night, Yolandi and Herman would be waterboarded for the first time. And this would soon become John's favorite form of torture against his kids. He would place them in the bathtub on their backs. He would take a washcloth, put it on their faces, and then he would pour water over the washcloth. John also started using water in his various other torture methods. He would hold the children's heads underwater. He would force them to sit in ice-cold baths for hours at a time in winter. And when he beat the children, he would always make sure Sam brought him a bucket of water so he could splash it in their faces at the end of the beating. Although Yolandi was severely tortured and abused, Herman got the worst of it. He would be regularly tied up so that he couldn't move and be beaten, and then he would be left tied up overnight. John tried to drown him once in the swimming pool, and there was a time that John had become paranoid that the police were aware of his drug activities, so he told Herman to just watch the CCTV cameras just to see if police officers got to the house or were just like parked in front of the house watching them. And after a few hours of Herman just watching this, he got really tired, so he decided to change the channel to just like regular TV. And as soon as John saw this, he got so angry and upset that he picked up a TV set and threw it over John's head, and this caused him to tear like his ear. It was split into 2 at the top of it, and the children were really given medical attention, but there were instances like this where Yolandi couldn't fix the injury and the children had to go to the hospital. So Sam then took Herman to the hospital so that they could fix his ear. But she returned later and said that they were taking too long to see them, and she didn't want to upset John by staying away for too long. Yolandi then tried to stick her brother's ear back together with a plaster and hoped that it would just grow closed, but it didn't. John would continue to abuse his wife Sam too. Yolandi remembers there was one time where John started chasing Sam around the house with a knife, and she just kept trying to get away from him. She kept running and running, and eventually she just got so tired that she stopped running, and then John took the knife and stabbed her in the buttocks. And he was shocked when she started bleeding, and he thought that nothing would happen because he said that the knife was blunt. And Sam then had to go to the hospital to get stitches. There was another time where John hit her with the stick that she used to play snooker, and he hit her in the cheek, and there was like a little splinter stuck in her cheek that they couldn't get out at home, and she then had to go to the hospital to get the splinter taken out of her cheek. The abuse in the house escalated when John decided to experiment with his waterboarding torture. One day he came home with an electric cattle prod, and it's the type that's used to move cattle along that enclosure that they're in. And this device releases high voltage and low current electric shock, and it isn't enough to kill an animal or even a human like a person, but it is extremely painful. And John would use this on both Yolandi and Herman. And then one day he decided to involve his fascination with waterboarding and this cattle electric prod that he had. So he made the children sit in a bath, he filled it with ice cold water, and then he would use this electric prod that he had to shock the children in the water. He also had a gas powered gun and it shot pellets, so it couldn't kill the children, but when he shot it at them, it was painful. He also came home one day with a blowtorch and he set it high enough to singe the children's hair and also burn their skin a little. And sometimes he would set this blowtorch a little too high and this would burn the children and they would never be taken to a hospital to get it checked out. He also used pepper spray on them. John worked and he also rented out the rooms in the house, so he did make an income, but he would never spend his money on his children. He would only spend the money on his wife Sam as well as himself. But even on him spending money on Sam, it was what he wanted. So he would buy themselves clothes, but the clothes that he would buy for Sam would be very revealing clothing. She couldn't choose what she wanted to wear. He decided what she wore. And because he didn't buy the children clothes, the clothes that he would buy for Sam would then be given to Yolandi to wear, and it was not age appropriate clothing. The clothes that the children wore were just shared between them and they'd never get clothes just for themselves. Food was also something completely different. John put Yolandi in charge of making sure that there was constantly food available for this family of 7. So he would put money on the table and expect Yolandi to be able to make the money last. Sometimes he would even just put 50 rand. Mind you, some of the children were still in nappies, they were on formula, and he would just give her 50 rand and she had to make sure that it was enough money. So because of this, sometimes she would steal the tenants' money. She would just sneak into their rooms and take money from their wallets just to make sure that there was enough food for the family. They would often just eat the same things. They would eat like your 2-minute noodles or your pasta. But sometimes when John was feeling nice, he would buy them takeouts. But if they upset him, he would just buy takeouts for himself. Also, Yolandi was not allowed to leave the house, so she had to buy food for the family, but she wasn't allowed to leave. So because of this, she would have to ask the tenants to please go buy food for them. The children also suffered from serious dental issues due to their poor diet, and they also looked physically younger than they actually were. When the children were ill, Yolandi had to somehow make the food money that she got stretch for medicine. The children's birthdays were also never acknowledged, so it was a huge shock when Yolandi turned 16 and John said that he was taking the family to Spur to celebrate. So they went to Spur, had good food, they returned home, and then John bought Yolandi an electric car. She was 16, she couldn't even drive, but somehow he had managed to buy this electric car and he had allowed her to sit in the car for a couple of minutes, and then a couple of days later the car just disappeared and it was never spoken of again. A few weeks after Yolandi turned 16, one of her sisters cut open her toe, so Sam had to take her to the hospital. And once they had left, John called Yolandi upstairs. And then he told her to take off her clothes, and then he raped her for the first time. Over the next few months, John would continue to sexually assault Yolandi on several occasions. And Yolandi would later say that being R-worded was the worst experience of her childhood. And she said that she could take being tortured and beaten up, but there's this feeling of worthlessness and shame that she felt after her own father would R-word her, and there's nothing compared to that. John would also discuss his sex life with his own daughter and force her to watch pornography with him. It was around this time that Herman started resisting John's attempts to beat him, and he would run away and hide in the yard. On the evening of the 19th of May 2015, John said that he felt like takeaways, so he was looking for his car keys and he couldn't find them. So he asked Herman where his car keys were, and he was getting angrier and angrier, and Herman knew what was coming. So because of this, he ran away before John could do anything to him. And then John eventually found his car keys, so he left to go get takeaways. And Yolandi then decided to go check on Herman, and she saw him like climbing over the wall to get to the next door neighbor's house, and she managed to grab his leg and try to stop him, but he managed to get out of her grasp and made it to the next door neighbors, who were the Venters, and that's how we started the beginning of this case. Yolandi was terrified about what John would do when he got back and found out that Herman was gone, so Yolandi went to go tell Sam. Once they got back from the Venter home, John tied Herman to the snooker table and beat him until his eyes were completely swollen shut. Yolandi had to feed him that night because he couldn't even open his own eyes and couldn't see, and she remembers thinking that he had livers on his eyes. You can't go online and find the picture of him. It is a couple of days later, but it was still really badly bruised. I won't be inserting it. The next day, the 17 police officers and 3 social workers arrived at the home in Springs. And one of the social workers said that the house was in such a terrible state that it smelled of old cigarette smoke and mold, and that there were needles lying around and a snooker table piled high with revealing women's clothing. There were also high heels scattered around, and the children also started drawing on them. The social worker also saw a rat that was as large as a rabbit run across the floor. One side of the TV cabinet was completely filled with a pornography collection. All the bathrooms in the home were damaged, with basins having been smashed, no toilet seats, and kicked in doors. The children were also said to be really filthy and dressed in clothes that were torn up, almost as though they were clothes that you would maybe find a homeless person wearing. And once the 17 police officers and the social workers got into the house, the children clung onto Yolandi like she was their mom. And at the time, the social workers believed that she was their mom, based on how they were just holding her and how they didn't want to let go. The police demanded to know where the children's father was, and all of a sudden John appeared, and he just seemed all high and mighty and asked them what they wanted. So they asked him where his oldest son was, which was Herman, and he just told them that he had run away and he didn't know where he was. But it turned out when they heard that the police and the social workers were outside, John grabbed Herman and dunked him in the pool to wash off the blood. He then took him to one of the tenants' rooms and told him to hide in the ceiling. And initially, John also wanted to hide there too, but he left Herman in the ceiling and returned to the house. The police searched the house, but Herman was not found, and the remaining children were removed from the premises and taken to a place of safety. When asked why none of the children were in school, Sam claimed that she homeschooled them, but she wasn't able to produce any documents to prove that they were being homeschooled. And it turned out that Yolandi was the only one that was able to read or write. Herman couldn't even write his own name. After the police left, John arranged for Herman to be taken by some family members in the Free State, and he just told them that Herman had gotten into some trouble. He had been involved in a fight, so they just wanted him away from the situation until everything cooled down. But John and Sam continued to deny that they knew where Herman was to the police, and even opened a missing person case for him. And police really thought the worst. They thought that John had killed him. Within a week, John was arrested, and shortly after that, Sam was arrested too. At the time of his arrest, John was 36 years old. And now that Sam was finally away from John, she told investigators where they could find Herman. John was charged with the abuse and R-word of his daughter Yolandi, the attempted murder of Herman, obstruction of justice relating to the initial on-site search, 5 charges of child abuse, 5 charges of child neglect, 2 charges of breaking the Schools Act, showing pornographic material to his underage daughter, and using and distributing crystal meth. Sam was charged with child abuse, child neglect, and defeating the ends of justice. And at first, Sam had agreed to turn state witness and testify against John, but she kept going back on her word, and they believe she did this because John had sent people to threaten her and say that if she testified against him, then he would do something to her. Eventually, Sam was released on bail, and her bail was 2,000 Rand, and her attorney managed to do this by stating that she had also been a victim of abuse. The 5 siblings were initially placed in the temporary custody of their aunt, who was Sam's sister, and they stayed with her for several months in the run-up to the trial until it came out that her husband had been sexually abusing not only his stepdaughter, but Yolandi as well. He was then arrested, and he tried to take his own life, and then he was in a hospital where he managed to escape, and he has been on the run ever since. John was denied bail, and after seeing the evidence that they had against them, he too tried to take his own life, but he did survive. It's also said that he told some inmates in jail that he didn't understand why everyone was so angry with him for not wanting to take his children to school, and apparently he said that he was protecting them from the monsters at school. It's also said that he broke down in jail because he was so scared about what was going to happen to him. After having been removed from the care of their aunt, the children were split up. The 3 younger children were placed in several foster homes, but the pressure of dealing with 3 severely traumatized small children was too much for a set of foster parents. So in the interest of trying to keep the younger children together, they were sent to live in a children's home. Herman also moved through a few foster homes before he ended up in a special education institution with living facilities. Yolandi went through a very difficult time after having been removed from her parents, and at first she was so angry and upset with Herman, and she blamed him for them not having a stable home and just like ruining their family. But she slowly came to the realization that he had actually saved them, and that the first 16 months of her life were not normal, to say the least. During the trial, Sam still showed zero care or interest in her children, and she continued to support her husband. They would whisper whilst he sat in the dogs, they would hold hands, and even after she found out that he had R-worded Yolandi, she still supported him. The children all wrote out statements, and they were interviewed on camera during the trial with the help of a facilitator, so they didn't have to see their father, John. And John instructed his attorney to claim that Yolandi had been the one to seduce him, and that he didn't even think that he was her biological father, and that's why he had sex with her. He also blamed Herman and said that he never hit Herman, he only hit him in self-defense. And Sam also said the same thing. She said that Herman had been the one to hit John, so John was just protecting himself. Eventually, John was found guilty of all the charges against him and sentenced to 35 years in prison. Sam was found guilty of child neglect, but not child abuse, as it was determined that she had not physically harmed the children herself, and the judge felt that any participation she had done was under duress, and so she received a suspended sentence. A forensic psychologist also evaluated John, and during the pre-sentencing, she said that she believed that John should go to prison and that him not being behind bars would cause further psychological harm on his children. And she also said that she believed that John was not only a sadist, but a psychopath as well. Sam was said to be suffering from battered woman syndrome, and she also showed traits of a person suffering from Stockholm syndrome. And during the trial, the couple did divorce. Whilst in prison, John became involved in a new relationship, and this was to a woman who was visiting another offender. And then she saw John and somehow fell in love. Sam got married again, but she married one of John's cousins, and then in 2019 she welcomed a child with him. She has still never spoken to her children ever since the arrest, and I don't really think that she's interested in them. In 2023, Herman did an interview, which is why we have his name today, and he seems to be doing a lot better. In 2019, he wasn't doing too well, and he really thought that he was never going to get over the trauma of what had happened to him. But in that interview, he seemed happier and like he was thriving. Yolandi is now 26 years old, and she managed to matriculate and also get her driver's license. She hopes to have children of her own one day and to adopt children as well, and she strongly encourages people to adopt. She says that she's had amazing foster parents and she wants to give someone the same love that she received from them. She wrote a book about her experience that I will link in the description box below, and in the book, she used her real name, which is why we have it today. Where the three young children are, I'm not too sure. They are all still minors, but I hope wherever they are healing and thriving. In the description box below, I will have a list of helplines and resources. You matter. Look after yourself and don't be afraid to reach out for help. And that's it for today's case. I know it was a heavy one, but thank you guys so much for watching. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. It helps out my channel a lot, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.